Have you ever caught yourself living according to others' expectations rather than your own desires? Have you smiled and nodded while inside you were screaming in protest? Perhaps you've been feeling drained lately, but can't quite put your finger on why. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from emotional betrayal, self-betrayal. It happens so gradually you barely notice it. A small compromise here, a silent acquiescence there. You swallow your truth to keep the peace. You dim your light to avoid outshining others. You shape yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. And for a while, this strategy seems effective. People appreciate your adaptability. They value your agreeableness. You become the person everyone can count on, the one who never rocks the boat. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, something is dying. An essential part of you is withering away from neglect. Carl Jung called this facade the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the world. We all need one. It's a necessary adaptation for social survival. But there's a profound danger when you no longer distinguish between the mask and your authentic self. When you forget that beneath the carefully curated exterior lives a wild, unpredictable, gloriously imperfect human being with desires that don't fit neatly into social conventions, with anger that isn't always rational, with thoughts that aren't always acceptable. When this happens, a fracture occurs within. You feel it as a vague uneasiness, a sense of living someone else's life, as though you're performing in a play with no intermission and no final curtain. This video isn't about rejecting all social norms or abandoning responsibility. It's about something more fundamental, recognizing when your need for approval is severing your connection to your authentic self. It's about pausing long enough to ask whether the life you're living is truly yours, or merely a performance designed to earn validation. And make no mistake, this pattern of self-abandonment extracts a heavy toll. It manifests as chronic anxiety, as identity confusion, as unexplained resentment, and as a pervasive sense of loss that you can't quite articulate. Today, we're going to face this reality head-on. We'll examine what Jung discovered about the complex relationship between the ego, the persona, and the unconscious. We'll explore why people-pleasing isn't simply a personality trait, but rather a symptom of profound self-disconnection. And perhaps most importantly, we'll discuss how to begin the journey back to yourself. Consider this video both a mirror and a wake-up call. If you found your way here, some part of you already suspects that you can't continue as you have been. So take a deep breath, because what follows may challenge everything you thought you knew about who you really are. From your earliest years, you were taught to accommodate others, to suppress your natural impulses in favor of politeness, to prioritize harmony over honesty, to smile through discomfort rather than acknowledge it. You learned that acceptance came with conditions, and love was something you had to earn through proper behavior. And so, without conscious awareness, you crafted a version of yourself designed to maximize approval, a persona. Jung described the persona as a psychological construct, a character we develop to interact with the social world. It serves an important function, allowing us to navigate complex social environments, fulfill our roles, and participate in community life. The problem arises when we mistake this functional mask for our true identity. You pretend to be unaffected by criticism, when in reality it wounds you deeply. You maintain the appearance of endless patience, when internally you're approaching your breaking point. You present yourself as perpetually accommodating because that's what's expected of you. But with each instance of self-denial, with each moment of silent acquiescence, something precious is being sacrificed. Each time you swallow your truth to avoid rocking the boat, each time you ignore your intuition to conform to expectations, Each time you say, "It's fine," when everything within you is screaming that it's not. In those moments, you're severing the connection to your authentic self. This pattern of repeated self-betrayal creates increasingly deep fissures in your psyche. Over time, the person beneath the mask begins to fade. Your genuine preferences become obscured. Your emotions become inaccessible. Your decisions become reflexive rather than reflective. You find yourself living according to an external script rather than an internal compass. At this point, the persona has transformed from a useful tool into a psychological prison. And here's the cruelest irony. From the outside, everything appears successful. You receive validation for your adaptability. You're praised for your reliability. You seem accomplished, functional, perhaps even fulfilled. But internally, a slow death is occurring. The mask has fused to your skin, and you've forgotten how to remove it without feeling as though you're tearing away your very identity. But is maintaining this carefully crafted image worth the cost of abandoning your truth? How many times have you remained silent when something needed to be said? How many times have you agreed to things that violated your boundaries? How many times have you projected calm while chaos reigned within? The truth is that your persona should serve you, not command you. When you over-identify with this social role, you begin living as a fragment of your whole self. And this fragmentation inevitably disconnects you from your soul, from the vital center of your being. It's precisely at this point that something within you begins to resist. This resistance manifests as inner conflict. In the next segment, we'll explore this silent battle between the conscious ego and the unconscious psyche and understand what happens when you persistently deny your own truth. Let's continue. There is a war being waged within you, though the battlefield remains invisible to others. On one side stands the ego, that conscious aspect of your psyche that craves social acceptance, stability, recognition, and belonging. It's the ego that maintains your social image, that fears rejection, that attempts to control your presentation to ensure continued approval. On the opposing side stands the unconscious, profound, symbolic, untamed, and it refuses to compromise. It demands authenticity. While your ego labors to maintain the persona, your unconscious begins to protest. It doesn't communicate through logical arguments or clear directives. Instead, it sends subtle signals, vague discomfort, disproportionate emotional responses, inexplicable physical sensations. You find yourself anxious without apparent cause, irritated by trivial matters, exhausted despite adequate rest, melancholic when circumstances suggest you should feel content. These symptoms represent only the beginning. They are the muffled cry of a soul being systematically ignored. Jung observed that when the ego strays too far from psychic wholeness, the unconscious initiates a compensatory response, like an internal balancing mechanism struggling to restore equilibrium. And the more forcefully the ego insists on maintaining appearances, the more powerfully the unconscious reacts. If you strain to perfect the persona, the unconscious responds by activating the shadow, and the shadow, when repressed, doesn't simply vanish. It infiltrates your unconscious behaviors, your relationships, your self-destructive patterns, your persistent sense of alienation from yourself. This psychological conflict generates a state of chronic tension. You strive to maintain control, yet something continually escapes your grasp. You perform correctly but feel hollow. You meet external expectations while harboring internal resentment, confusion, and fatigue. And the anger you suppress isn't primarily directed outward, it's aimed at yourself. Each time you betray your truth for the sake of acceptance, you break faith with your authentic being. This self-betrayal doesn't produce immediate pain. It accumulates gradually, depleting your vitality from within. It's a slow corrosion of the soul. The challenge is that this conflict remains largely invisible to others. People observe your functional exterior and assume you're well. You maintain the smile, fulfill your obligations, manage your responsibilities, but internally, you've lost connection with your genuine emotions. You only know that something fundamental is amiss, and you can no longer sustain the pretense that everything is fine. You might continue ignoring these signals. You might tell yourself it's temporary. You might intensify your efforts to adapt. But the price for such denial is severe. An existence devoid of authenticity, purpose, and soul connection. However, there's value in understanding why this pattern develops and why certain individuals appear particularly vulnerable to it. Those who consistently prioritize others' needs, who experience guilt about their own requirements, who gradually erase themselves without conscious awareness. Jung identified a specific psychological type that demonstrates special susceptibility to this dynamic. And it's this type we'll examine next. In the following segment, you'll discover whether this profile describes your own psychological structure and why this recognition might provide the key to breaking the cycle. Let's proceed. Not all individuals process experience in identical ways. Jung demonstrated that each person possesses a unique psychological constitution, comprised of specific functions and fundamental attitudes that determine how we perceive reality and make decisions. Among the various psychological types Jung identified, one demonstrates particular vulnerability to excessive people-pleasing: the extroverted feeling type. This type doesn't merely value connection, it requires it. For these individuals, maintaining harmony with their social environment represents a form of emotional survival. Their internal system is calibrated to detect what others feel, think, and expect. They enter social situations and immediately adjust their behavior to please, avoid conflict, and secure acceptance. Their attention focuses not on themselves, but on others. Their sense of identity, self-worth, and psychological security all are anchored in the reflection they perceive in others' responses. Superficially, this might appear as simple empathy, kindness, or social grace, but when taken to its extreme, which it frequently is, this mode of functioning creates fertile ground for self-betrayal. The extroverted feeling type lives for validation. Their internal moral compass easily becomes disoriented because they're constantly attempting to align with external values, even when those values conflict with their innermost truth. They may defend ideas they don't genuinely believe, maintain relationships that suffocate them, tolerate situations that damage them, all to preserve an appearance of acceptability. This type hasn't learned to ask, "What do I want?" but rather, "What is expected of me?" And this inverted orientation inevitably leads to collapse, because no matter how diligently they strive, pleasing everyone remains impossible. Each perceived failure, each rejection, each criticism registers as a direct assault on their fundamental worth. And perhaps most dangerously, this type often fails to recognize their self-betrayal because they operate automatically, addicted to the sensation of being needed, loved, and approved. They confuse being valued with being useful. And when they're not fulfilling the role of pleasant, helpful, understanding supporter, they feel devoid of worth, as if their existence lacks justification unless they're serving someone else. But understand, this dynamic isn't exclusive to this psychological type. It appears to varying degrees in many individuals. Whenever you agree to something against your better judgment, simply to avoid disappointing someone, whenever you withhold your perspective out of fear of rejection, whenever you minimize your suffering to avoid inconveniencing others, in those moments, you're operating according to the same psychological principle. that external acceptance matters more than internal authenticity. However, this pattern exacts a toll, and your unconscious will eventually signal its distress. It doesn't communicate through straightforward messages. It speaks through symbols, dreams, unexplained compulsions, and symptoms that seem to lack obvious causes. The unconscious begins quietly revealing everything you're refusing to acknowledge. And it's precisely these invisible yet crucial signals we'll examine in the next segment. We'll explore how the unconscious attempts to rescue your truth when you persistently ignore it. We'll discuss dreams, symbols, and soul messages that you must learn to decipher. Prepare to venture even deeper. The unconscious doesn't communicate in logical propositions. It doesn't express itself through clear statements, rational arguments, or explicit warnings. It whispers and sometimes shouts through images, impulses, symbols, sensations, and recurring experiences. When you begin living in dissonance with your inner truth, the unconscious doesn't remain passive. It attempts to restore psychological balance by sending signals. But the difficulty is that most people haven't been taught to interpret this symbolic language. These signals may manifest as vivid or disturbing dreams. Perhaps you dream of being publicly exposed, of being pursued by threatening figures, of trying to speak but producing no sound, of being trapped in inescapable situations. These dreams aren't meaningless mental static during sleep. They're encoded messages, symbolic representations of a destabilizing psychological state. The nakedness may symbolize the forced exposure of your authentic self. The pursuit might represent the relentless pressure of maintaining the persona. The silence could signify the powerlessness of your will. The confinement might indicate the imprisonment of the soul in an inauthentic existence. Other signals emerge through bodily symptoms: pain without medical explanation, persistent exhaustion, panic attacks, breathing difficulties, insomnia. The body, as an extension of the psyche, also registers protest. When symbolic communication goes unheeded, the unconscious resorts to physical expression. It represents a final attempt to disrupt your automatic patterns and force confrontation with long-neglected aspects of self. There are also compulsive behaviors. You claim everything is fine, yet you eat excessively, shop compulsively, seek constant distraction, consume endless social media, accumulate stimuli and tasks, all to avoid stillness. Because in stillness, you begin to hear the soul's voice, and it has uncomfortable truths to share. Facing these realities is painful. It hurts to recognize that you've constructed a life disconnected from your authentic being. It hurts to acknowledge that many of your choices stemmed not from genuine desire, but from fear. Fear of being unloved, fear of disappointing others, fear of rejection. But ignoring these signals doesn't eliminate them. On the contrary, the more you resist, the more intensely they manifest. The psyche cannot indefinitely tolerate inauthenticity. It demands integration, and if you refuse to acknowledge your truth, it will employ increasingly disruptive means to compel your attention, even if that requires dismantling your carefully constructed facade. Jung proposed that the unconscious serves a compensatory function, attempting to rebalance the psyche when the ego veers too extremely in one direction. If you consistently prioritize pleasing others while denying your desires and avoiding necessary conflict, the unconscious will push toward the opposite extreme: aggressive dreams, impulses toward radical independence, emotional crises that confront you with your shadow aspects. As frightening as this process may seem, it contains profound healing potential. It's precisely through this symbolic breakdown that reconstruction becomes possible, but now proceeding from authenticity rather than accommodation. However, intellectual understanding alone isn't sufficient. What's required is a profound process of psychological transformation, a path Jung termed individuation. In the next segment, we'll explore this process, what it truly entails, why it involves necessary pain alongside liberation, and how it can free you from the prison of the persona without destroying everything you've built. Let's journey together toward wholeness. Eventually, the cost of pleasing others becomes unsustainable. You recognize that despite your exhaustive efforts to maintain the perfect image, something within is collapsing. The fatigue transcends physical limitations. It penetrates to the level of existence itself. The emptiness is no longer an occasional sensation, but a constant companion. The awareness that you're living someone else's life becomes intolerable. And it's precisely at this breaking point that the process of individuation can begin. Individuation, in Jung's framework, isn't a luxury of self-improvement. It represents a fundamental psychological necessity. It describes the soul's movement toward wholeness, the integration of all aspects of self, including those that have been denied, suppressed, or forgotten to facilitate social functioning. It doesn't involve abandoning the persona entirely, but rather breaking your complete identification with it, ceasing to believe that you are merely the role you perform, and remembering that a deeper self exists beneath the social masks. This process demands courage. It requires confrontation with everything you've pushed beyond conscious awareness, the accumulated frustrations you've swallowed, the authentic desires you've ignored, the fears disguised as responsibilities. It means facing your shadow, everything you reject in yourself, but that exists nonetheless. Your contradictions, your morally ambiguous impulses, your anger, your pride, your controlling tendencies, your emotional neediness, everything you conceal even from yourself. Individuation requires the courage to disappoint those who have come to expect a version of you that isn't authentic, to relinquish superficial approval in pursuit of an inner coherence that initially feels isolating but ultimately liberates. This path isn't about achieving perfection, it's about embracing wholeness. You begin recognizing that you comprise opposites, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability. And through this acceptance, you cease living for external validation and start living from internal authority. Here lies the greatest challenge. You may lose relationships, you may sacrifice status, comfort, or control. But what you gain holds immeasurably greater value. Your reconnection to soul, to voice, to will, to something arising from within that requires no external validation. Individuation represents this radical return to inner truth. It marks the moment when you decide, with all the accompanying pain and beauty, to live from your center rather than from others' reflections. It's an extended process, uncomfortable, transformative, but it offers the only authentic path to freedom. Because as long as you remain identified solely with the persona, you remain enslaved to image. And images possess no inherent vitality. They are projections, not existence. But what follows this transformation? What happens when you begin living from authentic selfhood? How do you navigate the world without the mask, without the character, without the armor of the persona? What emerges after the pain of disidentification and before the peace of rediscovery? In our final segment, we'll address these questions, exploring the truth that frightens but ultimately liberates. Let's complete this journey together, recognizing that every meaningful ending simultaneously constitutes a beginning. At this point, you may be experiencing something unusual, a mixture of recognition and discomfort. Because somehow all of this resonates deeply, yet it also disturbs your carefully maintained equilibrium. And it's precisely this discomfort that signals something within you has begun to shift. The truth is that having arrived at this point in our journey, you're no longer the same person who began it, because now you know. And once truth enters consciousness, it refuses to depart quietly. You weren't born to fulfill others' expectations. You didn't enter this world to perform a role, please invisible audiences, and accumulate approvals while silencing your own soul. You exist to live authentically, to embody wholeness, to stand firmly in your truth, even when it costs you admiration, relationships, stability, convenience, because what you sacrifice on this path was never truly yours, and what you gain is everything. The persona can protect you, it can secure your position in the social order, but it will never provide genuine peace, because peace doesn't originate externally. Peace emerges from internal alignment between what you feel, what you think, what you believe, and how you live. And this peace, this profound congruence, becomes possible only when you summon the courage to stop betraying yourself. Freedom doesn't arrive through others' validation. It manifests when you finally validate yourself, when you can face your reflection without masks and declare, "I stand with you regardless of circumstances." And this commitment to your own truth represents a quiet revolution that transforms everything. But this revolution doesn't occur instantaneously. It unfolds gradually through incremental decisions, through conversations like this one. So if this exploration has moved you, if at any moment you felt it speaking directly to your soul, I invite you to share your response in the comments below. Describe what you're feeling in this moment. Express what resonated most deeply. Give voice to what's stirring within you. This space belongs to you as well, and by articulating your experience, you not only share, you make a commitment to yourself. And remember, this represents just one step. Another exploration awaits you in our next video, and it holds equal, if not greater, importance than this one. Because once begun, the journey of self-knowledge cannot be abandoned. It can only deepen, so continue forward. Return to your inner world and prepare to venture still deeper. Truth liberates, but only when you choose to face it completely. Until next time.